Right now, 3 Chinese warships are sitting in the Gulf of Oman. They were not invited. They were not announced. They simply showed up. The largest of them is so big and so packed with electronics that the United States Navy has been quietly tracking it for months. The other two are heavily armed escorts, the kind of ships China builds to fight other navies, not to chase pirates. And while President Trump was on television announcing a full naval blockade of Iran's ports, while American destroyers were already moving into the Strait of Hormuz, those 3 Chinese warships were already in the water, watching everything, less than 100 miles from where the United States Navy has just promised to stop and board any vessel that has paid Iran for safe passage. This is not a coincidence. This is not a routine deployment. The country that buys 90% of Iran's oil just put warships in the same ocean where the United States Navy is preparing to seize Iranian oil tankers. And the most important question in global maritime security right now is the one almost nobody in mainstream news is asking out loud. What happens when one of those Chinese warships pulls up next to one of those Iranian oil tankers and a United States destroyer arrives to do a boarding inspection? By the end of this video, you will fully understand exactly what those Chinese ships are, why they are sitting in the Gulf right now, what China is actually trying to do with this deployment, and why the next 48 hours could decide whether the American blockade holds together or falls apart in front of the entire world. Let us start with the largest of those 3 Chinese ships, because understanding what it actually is changes everything about how you read the rest of this story. The ship is called Liaowang 1. The name translates roughly to Watcher 1, and the name is honest. This is not a warship in the traditional sense. There are no missile tubes lining its deck. It is not built to sink other ships. What Liaowang 1 is, in the simplest possible terms, is a floating supercomputer the size of a medium ocean liner. 30,000 tons of steel, sensors, antennas, and processing equipment all bolted onto a single hull sitting in the middle of the ocean, listening. To understand what that ship can do, picture a very specific scene. Imagine you are standing on a beach. You can see with your eyes, maybe a few hundred yards down the shoreline. Now imagine someone hands you a pair of binoculars that not only let you see across the entire ocean, but also let you hear every conversation happening on every ship within 1,000 miles, read the radar signals coming from every aircraft within 2,000 miles, and intercept every encrypted military message bouncing through the satellites overhead. That is roughly what Liaowang 1 does, except it does it for a region that stretches from the eastern coast of Africa to the western edge of India. China's Navy refers to the area covered by this single ship as a sensor bubble, and that bubble extends roughly 6,000 kilometers in every direction. It can sense everything happening in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Persian Gulf, across the Arabian Sea, and into the Indian Ocean, all at the same time from one parking spot. Now here is where it gets really interesting. A floating supercomputer is not a fighting ship. It cannot defend itself against missiles, against aircraft, against attack submarines. So China did not send Liaowang 1 alone. It sent 2 combat ships with it as bodyguards. The first is a Type 055 cruiser, which is currently the largest, most heavily armed surface warship China has ever built. Roughly 13,000 tons, big enough to carry 112 vertical missile launchers built directly into its deck. Each of those launchers can hold an air defense missile, an anti-ship missile, a land attack missile, or an anti-submarine weapon. Think of it as a massive floating missile rack with the ability to engage targets in every direction simultaneously. The second escort is a Type 052D destroyer, slightly smaller at 7,500 tons, with 64 of those vertical launchers on its deck. These 2 ships together carry roughly the same combined firepower as a small American carrier strike group's escorts. That is what is sitting in the Gulf of Oman right now, less than 200 miles from the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. A floating supercomputer with the ability to see and hear everything in the region, protected by 2 of the most heavily armed warships in the Chinese fleet. And every American destroyer enforcing the blockade right now is being watched, recorded, and analyzed by that ship. But here is the problem. China is not just there to watch. China has a very real and very urgent reason to be there, and that reason is sitting in storage tanks all over Iran's coast. China imports roughly 1.4 million barrels of crude oil from Iran every single day. That number, in plain terms, accounts for about 13% of all the oil China brings into its country. Every refinery in Shanghai, every factory in Guangzhou, every truck and bus and car burning diesel in mainland China, a meaningful share of all of it runs on Iranian oil. And that oil moves on tankers. Those tankers leave from Iranian ports. Those tankers pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Those tankers cross the same water where Liaowang 1 is sitting right now. And every single one of those tankers, under the rules Trump announced on Sunday, is now considered a target for American interdiction the moment it leaves an Iranian port or pays an Iranian toll. This is the math that has put 3 Chinese warships in the Gulf of Oman. Iran is China's largest single foreign oil supplier. The blockade does not just hurt Iran. The blockade hurts China at the gas pump, at the factory loading dock, at the diesel generator behind every Chinese hospital. China cannot afford to lose this supply line. And China has now physically positioned military assets in the same waterway where the United States is trying to cut that supply line off. Think about what that means in practical terms. American destroyers are now operating in waters where Chinese warships are also operating. American boarding teams are preparing to climb onto tankers in waters where the Chinese Navy can watch every movement, intercept every radio call, and respond if it chooses to. The blockade was designed assuming Iran would be the only adversary. The blockade was not designed assuming China would put warships in the same ocean. And now everyone from the Pentagon to Wall Street oil traders to every shipping insurance company in London is asking the same question. What happens at the moment of contact? A senior BBC analyst put it as bluntly as any expert has dared to say it on television. If a Chinese warship is sitting off an Iranian-linked tanker and an American destroyer arrives to board it, what does the American captain do? Does he order armed sailors onto the deck of a tanker that is, at that moment, under the protection of a Chinese cruiser carrying 112 missiles? If he does, China has a casus belli. That is a Latin term, but the meaning is simple. It means a justified reason for war. China would be perfectly within its rights under international maritime law to interpret an armed boarding of a vessel under its protection as an act of aggression. If the American captain does not board, the blockade has failed. The Iranian tanker continues on its way to a Chinese refinery. Word spreads. Other tankers get the same protection. The entire blockade collapses inside of a week. Now stop and think about that situation honestly. The United States Navy spent decades building the most powerful surface fleet on the planet, specifically to project American power into waters like this. Iran's military is in ruins. Iran's air force is gone. Iran's regular navy is at the bottom of the sea. The Iranian regime is a shadow of what it was 6 weeks ago. By every traditional measurement, this should be a complete American victory. But the actual outcome of the entire blockade, the actual reopening of the world's most important shipping lane, may now come down not to what Iran does, but to what China does next. Is this America facing the consequences of trying to do too much with too little support? Or is this China overreaching by inserting itself into a conflict it cannot afford to lose? One side says America gambled, the other side says China bluffed. Write your answer in the comments, because the people who say America is in over its head and the people who say China will back down are about to have a very heated argument under this video. And it gets worse. The 3 warships in the Gulf are not the only signal China is sending. While Liaowang 1 was settling into its watch position, China's foreign minister was hosting Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in Beijing. The 2 men met for 2 days, on April 14th and 15th, while the American blockade was going into effect. The official subject of the meeting was a list of regional issues. The unofficial subject, according to every diplomatic reporter who covered it, was Iran. Russia and China are the 2 most powerful countries on Earth that still consider Iran a strategic partner. They are the 2 countries best positioned to provide Iran with weapons, intelligence, satellite tracking data, and diplomatic cover. They are also the 2 countries that the United States is currently confronting in 2 separate wars on 2 different continents, in Europe and in the Middle East. The fact that they chose this exact week to meet is not an accident. It is a message. The message is that Iran is not alone, and that any attempt to permanently strangle Iran will have consequences that extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. China's official statement on the blockade, delivered by Foreign Minister Wang Yi on the same day Lavrov arrived, was carefully chosen. The blockade, Wang said, does not serve the common interests of the world. It is a dangerous and irresponsible action. It will only escalate tensions, undermine the fragile ceasefire, and further endanger safe navigation through the strait. That language sounds diplomatic. It is not. In the careful world of international diplomacy, dangerous and irresponsible from a major power is a step away from a public threat. China was not condemning Iran. China was condemning the United States and doing it on the world stage while Russia stood beside it and Iran's tankers waited in port for someone to escort them out. There is another angle to this story that almost nobody is connecting yet. Most of the oil China buys from Iran is paid for not in American dollars, but in Chinese yuan, the official currency of mainland China. Some of it is paid in cryptocurrency. Almost none of it goes through the American banking system. This was not an accident either. China spent more than a decade building a parallel global trading network that does not depend on American dollars or American banks, specifically so that American sanctions could not reach its trade with countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. That trading network only works as long as the oil actually moves. If the oil stops moving because American destroyers are seizing the tankers carrying it, the entire alternative system that China built collapses in real time. Chinese refineries cannot run on yuan. They cannot spend on oil. They cannot receive beiswaradit. And every Chinese banker, every Chinese trader, every Chinese diplomat who spent years building the case for moving away from the dollar would be watching that case collapse on live satellite imagery from the Persian Gulf. That is why those 3 warships are sitting where they are. China does not just have an economic stake in keeping Iranian oil flowing. China has a credibility stake. Every other country that has been negotiating energy deals in yuan is watching what happens in the Gulf right now. Saudi Arabia is watching. The United Arab Emirates is watching. Brazil, India, Argentina, dozens of countries that have flirted with leaving the dollar system are watching. If China cannot protect its single biggest oil supply lane from American interdiction, the entire decade-long project of an alternative financial system collapses in a single image. That image is an American boarding team standing on the deck of an Iranian tanker while a Chinese cruiser sits 100 yards away and does nothing. This is where the conversation fundamentally changes. The blockade is not just about Iran anymore. The blockade is now a test of who actually controls the world's most important shipping lane and the financial system that depends on it. And the answer to that test is going to be written, possibly within the next few days, by what happens at the precise moment an American destroyer pulls up next to an Iranian tanker that has a Chinese warship sitting beside it. Think about what this means for the people in Washington running the operation. The American admiral commanding the blockade has a job that sounds simple. Stop the tankers. The reality is anything but. Every American destroyer captain now has to decide in real time whether the next tanker they encounter is being protected by a Chinese warship. The wrong answer could trigger a direct confrontation with the second most powerful navy in the world, in waters where China is closer to home than the United States is. Whatever they do will be on satellite imagery within minutes and on every news channel within an hour. Now, consider the situation from the Chinese side. The Chinese admiral commanding those 3 warships has an even more delicate job. He has to be present enough to deter American interference. He cannot fire a single shot because firing would start a war China is not yet prepared to fight. But he also cannot back down because backing down would tell the world that China will not actually defend its economic interests when push comes to shove. He has to project resolve without actually escalating. That is one of the most difficult assignments any naval commander has ever been given. Now here is where this affects people who do not follow naval geopolitics. If a Chinese warship and an American destroyer ever come into direct contact in the Strait of Hormuz, even if neither one fires a shot, the consequences flow into every economy on Earth almost immediately. Oil markets are already tense. Brent crude is above $103 per barrel. Any image of a confrontation between American and Chinese warships would push oil over $120 in a single trading session. Gasoline in the United States, currently at $4.13 per gallon, would push toward $5 within weeks. Diesel would follow. Every truck delivering food to every grocery store in the country would be paying more for fuel. And that cost would land on the price tag of every box of cereal, every gallon of milk, every package of meat. Inflation, which the Federal Reserve was already struggling to control, would surge again. And all of that would happen because of an interaction between two ships in a narrow waterway most Americans could not find on a map. There is one more piece of this story that deserves attention. The location China chose for these warships is the Gulf of Oman, not the Persian Gulf itself. The Gulf of Oman is the body of water just outside the Strait of Hormuz, where tankers exit on their way to the open Indian Ocean. By positioning there, China placed its ships exactly where American interdiction would be most active, while staying technically outside the strait itself. The message is calibrated. We are here to escort our tankers once they have left the strait. We are not provoking by entering it, but we are close enough to respond. This deployment was planned weeks in advance, possibly months. It was not a reaction to Trump's announcement. It was a position China had already established. So here is the question that matters now. 2 American carrier strike groups in the region. 18 American warships, including the USS Tripoli, with Marines aboard for boarding operations. A 3rd aircraft carrier, the USS George H.W. Bush, currently sailing around the southern tip of Africa to avoid the Houthis in the Red Sea, will arrive in the next 2 weeks. Against this stands a single Chinese intelligence ship and 2 Chinese escorts in the Gulf of Oman, plus the implicit threat that more Chinese warships could deploy if needed, plus a Russian-Chinese diplomatic alliance that has just been publicly reactivated. The question is no longer whether the United States can blockade Iran. The United States already is blockading Iran. The question is whether the United States is willing to escalate against China to make that blockade actually work, or whether the blockade quietly turns into a leaky cordon that lets Chinese protected tankers slip through while Iran's economy slowly bleeds out anyway. One side says Trump will not back down from China. The other side says no American president would risk a war with China over Iranian oil tankers. Write where you stand in the comments, because the people who say America forces this confrontation to a conclusion and the people who say China successfully neutralizes the blockade are about to have the most important argument on this channel. And if you have not seen our breakdown of how the United States Navy is actually going to enforce the blockade across the entire Strait of Hormuz, what ships are doing the work, and how every interception will be carried out, make sure to watch that one next.